Yes, Luke, thank you so much. And I'm really sorry, I'm not Shinan Wang. I am actually Luciane Aguiar Borges. And I'm sorry that I didn't inform you before that I was taking this presentation, but we will share the presentation actually. Perhaps if my connection is not very good, so if you needed my colleague Shinan, who is with us here, she will jump in and help me out.
Okay.
Yeah, and well, I am a senior research fellow at Nordregio. I'm not an expert like in maritime spatial planning, and I'm much more like a urban and regional planner. I have a PhD in planning and decision analysis from the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden, and I've been working at Nordregio like for 4 years nearly, and in different projects, but most of them like related to spatial land development in terms of cities and regions as well. And I have also like some experience in scenarios, and that's what I'm going to share today with you. And first of all, I would like to thank you very much for this opportunity, like to be here and to have share with you and discuss like the spatial perspectives that we have developed for the Baltic Sea region in the ESPON BT 2050. And I really hope that this will be useful and valuable, like to our discussion today about the marine spatial planning and reducing marine pollution in the Black Sea. I think before I start, I should just tell you a little bit about Nordreg was the lead partner of a consortium that we have like three other colleagues from Spatial Foresight from Luxembourg, and then also like Spatial Spiekermann and Wegner from Germany, and our colleagues from Poland, from IGSOPAS, from the Polish Academy of Science. But then just also, if you can change the slide, please. Yeah, so just like a bit of a background about the ESPON BT 2050, we actually start like in 2018, November 2018, and we finalized the project this year in April 2020 was the final we delivered like the final report after all the comments and so on, the stakeholders. This is a targeted analysis, so Michaela was telling and putting in place like the different types of projects that ESPON helps out, and so was a targeted analysis and was initiated by VASA, and VASA is like the cooperation of ministers that are responsible like for the spatial planning and development in the Baltic Sea region, including also like Belarus, Norway, and Russia. If you can change the slide, please. So the aim of the project was actually then to develop then the territorial scenarios for the Baltic Sea region to increase evidence based on the territorial dimension. And also there was like a very target aim that was like to help out VASA members in their work of designing and implementing like sound policy for the future of the Baltic Sea region. And then in this respect, there was a document that was like VASA long-term perspectives that was written in 2009, and the main objective is that the scenarios that we developed like in the project, they would then help out like to think a little bit about like out of the box and see how the future it is, and also like to kind of revise this document. We have not revised the document, but we just provided then like some ideas about in light of the scenarios that we developed. If you can change the slide, please, because I think I will explain the main outcomes. We had like 4 main outcomes in the project, and they are like very much linked like to this research framework. So we began like making a study about the development of the region in relation to demography, economy, environment, governance, using like recent data. So that's what you see like in this first box BSR development. We use like mainly quantitative methods. We look mainly like the data from 2006, around 2006, 2018, and this gave us like, well, how is the region developing? But along with this analysis, we also identify trends and factors that could influence development of the region in the future. And as well, like in this sense, we look a lot to the literature and so on. And we will also like identify some black swans, which are unforeseen events that can disrupt the development of the region. But this conceptual phase then has informed then the scenarios. We had like one baseline scenario for the years in two periods of time, 2030 and 2050, and two territorial scenarios, both of them for the year 2050. There are like very much the scenarios, the methodology applied in scenarios, they are like quite different, as you will see. And these are the two other outcomes that you have, and the final one then is like a kind of policy recommendations. I think it's quite important to highlight that throughout all this research process, like it is different phases, we had like the stakeholder engagement through like a lot of interviews, like with experts and like people involved in the region in different ways, like private sector as well. And then we have a lot of workshops with VASA members, but also like external people that were invited for different events, and as well as a focus group. If you can go to the next slide, please. So this the baseline scenario. The baseline scenario is basically like a business as usual scenario. It's a scenario that was mainly based on quantitative methods. It's a kind of a projection, like putting like really rough, a kind of a projection of the trends of today into the future. So how the region would develop, like if important factors will continue into effect, like in 2030 and 2050. There are like some assumptions that like we have to anchor these projections, and then we chose a kind of a steady development growth until 2050, as well like a constant inflow of migrants in Europe, and as well a further like integration in Europe, and that some policies like territorial policies at European and national level, they would also like continue into effect until the future. I want to highlight that Nordreg didn't develop this baseline scenario. This was developed by Spiekerman and Wegener, our partner, and they use like their own model, SASI model. So it's very interesting. Now, if you can go like to the next slide, please. So this is an example about like the population, like in 2030 and 2050 in the region. So as you can see, like in 2030, the population is about the same level, but most of the development takes place at capital cities, and this comes at the expenses of like rural areas that they lose like 30% of the population, as we can see like in the red colors in the first map. And then, like in this, for example, the Nordic countries on the other hand, they mainly grow, but we're accepting like Eastern Finland. But you can see like that the Baltic states, Russia and Belarus, they lose population. In 2050, we have like many regions, they lose up like more or less 1/3 of their population. So it's even worse a bit the scenario. Especially like Lithuania, Latvia, eastern part of Germany and Russia. But the capital region in most of the countries, they gain more population. So there is a polarization of people like in bigger cities. For example, like the capital cities of the Nordic countries, they increase the number of inhabitants by 50%. But the takeaway of when looking at this is that in general, like the most of the Baltic, the region, the countries, they shrink, excepting like Norway and Danish regions and some capitals as well. If we go to the next slide, please. The other thing that this baseline scenario did was projections about like the GDP per capita in 2030 and also like in 2050. And then in the first map, you see the GDP per capita projections, and as well like the change in the second one. But what we can see again is like the capital regions, they perform best, especially in the Nordic countries as well, together with other regions in the Nordic countries, yeah. And the lowest GDP is still to be found in Poland, in the Baltic states and Belarus regions. And then next slide, please. Yeah, and here we can see as well like the 2050, which is a quite similar pattern. Yeah, we still see like it is what we call like the divides in the Baltic Sea region. So this is like the old East and West divide in terms of economic performance, in which you have the Nordic countries like performing much better than the others. But what you what is a bit different is that the capital regions then, such in Poland and in Baltic states and Belarus and in St. Petersburg, they start to catch up in some sense. You can see like some shades of blue in the first map. But when we look at the difference between like the GDP per capita, like in 2016, in 2013, 2013, 2050, we have somehow like a kind of a between lines message, which is that we can notice a kind of a process of economic convergence, meaning that like the countries that they are like lagging behind, the growth rate of these countries is much higher than, for example, like the Nordic countries. And this indicates for the projections of this baseline scenario that the region might become more equal in the future. If we can go to the next slide. So quickly talking about this is like the territorial implications about, and then in this graph we have like the GDP per capita, yeah, and then in relation like to all the countries that are part of the Baltic Sea region, as well like the combined values like for the Baltic Sea regions, and these are disaggregated by the types of regions: urban regions, intermediate, and rural regions. And that what we can see is that economic imbalance is not only between countries of the BSI, but also between urban and rural areas, with few exceptions, yeah, which would be like in Russia, for example, in Belarus, we can see like that intermediate regions, they have a little bit more than they have like concentration of the GDP is a bit higher than in urban regions. But urban areas, they are higher than in other rural intermediate areas otherwise, and the capital regions of the Nordic countries, not the capital, but the urban areas, they have like the highest GDPs. If we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so I will just give a glimpse about like this was the baseline scenarios, and then when it comes like to this territorial scenarios, the methodology was quite different. So this was based a lot like in the literature review as well, like Nordrek has done a work about the main trends that could affect into the future, and then Spatial Foresight was the partner who actually like put together these narratives about the future. And there are like two main scenarios. One is called like well-being in a circular economy, and the other one growing into a green tech giant. So it's like a very different development paths that like the region might develop in 2015. Excuse me. So if you can go to the next slide. I will briefly talk about, so this is the well-being in a circular economy. We call like a remind for a good life. And this is mainly because like in 2050, then the Baltic Sea region has developed into a sharing and circular economic region where citizens have then consciously decided to change the existing linear economic model in favor of a better quality of life. That's why the remind for a good life. And then improving like the environmental performance is a priority in this scenario. Repairing and sharing culture, manufacturing, reindustrialization, and technology, they play a really big role. Companies, for example, like they close the loop, and also like people consume much less. And just to give an example, like in terms of how technology is important in the scenario, for example, it allows like the automation of jobs. In the automation of jobs, like allows as well like the production to take place more spread in the territory instead of only like in the metropolitan regions. And this ended up like with decentralized patterns in which like small and medium sizes second and third tier cities and towns, they become the main centers, and the metropolitan and large urban areas, they lose a bit of their importance. I think this is Spatial Foresight has produced like a lot of maps that I think that have a lot of relevance for what we have been discussing here. And then now I'm just giving a glimpse to you, but then also saying that, for example, these regional manufacturing networks, which is like this blue shade that you can see in the map, and hopefully you can identify. Hopefully it's not too small, and so we come like to a kind of a degree of specificity in terms of territory, saying that the high potential areas to host like these regional manufacturing networks. They are found like in the northeast of Poland, northeast of Estonia, and also like in other parts of Latvia and Lithuania as well, like the south of Sweden. So we come up with this, and this kind of development also change a little bit the change already, like might change the development of the region. If you can go to the next. And then the next slide shows as well the same scenario, but more a map which shows about like the connections and also like transportation in the region. And then we can see that the global and European airports, they lose their importance. Regional transportation networks, they become much more important because there is not so much interaction with outside the region. There is like regional centers. That's how people then they exchange the goods in a circular economy. So they are like a kind of centers that allow the citizens, people like to organize faster and more efficiently. And I will not go into detail because I think at the time it's a bit much, but we also have like mapping like agriculture and arable land, and also like the location of like a renewable energy and so on. Just a little bit about the next scenario, which is quite different, which is like then it comes like to the growing. If you can change the slide, please. Growing to green tech giants, the ecological footprint clear up. So in 2050, the BSR is a giant in green technology. This is the base thing, and then like a mix of innovation and green technology have led to a reduction to the ecological footprint of the region, but also to a guilt-free consumerism, which is more or less like this ecological modernization in which like people still behave in the way that we behave today, but the technology fix like all the environmental problems. So the economic activities increase around existing metropolitan areas in capital cities. In the next slide, we can see as well it's again like a map about the connections and also the transportation. And then you can see that the region is much more open, and much more connected as well internally through the, connected worldwide. So transportation hubs, they gain importance, and global connection stays global. So airports such as in Stockholm, Helsinki, Copenhagen, they remain global hubs, and there is like other airports that they also acquire like a new importance in this network. Ports as well, and then as I said, like not time, but there is a mapping as well, like of renewable production and also like the smart farming practices. If you go to the next, and then I think it's just like some final words about like the scope for policy choices and how does it help. I mean, I think it's really important to say that we do not claim and we do not identify one future or another as more desirable, and we do not claim that these futures, they will happen, that they will actually take place. But the way that we see they are like narratives, and that they are of course like founded like in literature research and then also like in current trends, but they offer, instead of dealing like with the baseline scenario, for example, that assumes that what has been happening will happen in the future, they give another more like alternative futures for the region. And this is particularly quite important, like especially if you want to make like a proactive planning, if you want like to think about how I could develop. And that's why I see, and I think all the consortium see the scenarios as a very good tool, like for mediating discussions, like between different stakeholders and so on. And well, I think, for example, in terms of VASA, the scenarios, they were like developed very much thinking about one particular policy document, which was like this VASA long-term perspective. And this document gives already, it was written in 2009, and gives already a kind of a spatial model about how the BSR should develop. So it's kind of easy for us to discuss the scenarios in relation to this document and draw then some kind of a very large or like a guidelines about what could change when updating this document. If you can go to the next slide. So just one example, like in this document, VASAB 2010, sorry, it was not 2009, says that by 2030, the Baltic Sea region has turned global challenges into assets. This is just an example how we can take the scenarios very broadly. But like in BT 2050, we saw that both scenarios, they offer like different pictures of a society as well as an economy, but there are like two things that they are like quite a constant between both. It's like climate change and the rapid technological progress, that they are like to happens in both scenarios. But even though there are like very different development paths. But what we can perhaps like what does it say to policymakers? If there is a need, for example, like we should end it up like with this myth of that thinking together like, oh, stricter like environmental policies may hamper economic growth. On the contrary, from now on, or like we should have started with this changing in the mindset like for a long time ago, actually, because they will be inseparable. If we want to live in this planet, we will have like to find a way to grow like in harmony, like with the environment, with the limits of the environment. And then yes, and also like another takeaways, like recognize and develop like the environmental mindset, and this is like mainly it's needed like awareness in society about the importance of like develop like within the limits, as well respecting the environment, and not only like awareness, but also like education can play like a very big role in a sense of like developing like new competencies and skills like for people to deal with a lot of challenges that seems to come ahead. Just next slide, please. And then just like a little bit of more structure, like how we did it. Then we took like this VASA LTP. We relate to baseline scenarios, to baseline and also like to the territorial scenarios. And then we came with a draft of these policy recommendations, which were discussed with mainly VASA members in a focus group, and then also related to other European documents. And then we ended up like with this final policy recommendations. The next slide shows this step a little bit more in detail. So we had like, for example, thematic areas that from 9 and from VASAB and 2 others we added. And then we relate these thematic areas that are in the document related to the different scenarios. We ended up like with 50 specific initial actions that we kind of boiled down and ended up in 8 key integrated actions. I should also say that this job about like looking at and drawing the policies, even though we had like a kind of course interaction, but the main responsible were our colleagues like from the Polish Academy of Science in there. Yeah. The next slide then just shows then kind of these names, a list of these key integrated actions. Here I just highlight a few of them. They are like kind of described very briefly, each one of them in the document. I invite you to actually to look in the ESPON website as well. There is like the reports, they are there, like we have synthesis report, quite small, and then we have also like the 2 big reports in which you can have like a very thorough description of all the scenarios as well as the key integrated actions. And I highlight the ones that seems to me that they were like most relevant for this audience. And then I just ended up with the last slide in which it's a figure that's not like from the it's not from BT 2050, but it was first sketched by a former colleague of us, Sarah, that I noticed that she's in the audience. So, and this was, for me, was a bit inspiring because when I got to this, as I said, I'm not an expert, but then just looking about like this land-sea planning continuum. So we have like the maritime in one side, the land base in another side, and then this integrated coastal zones management. And in between these two, we have like a lot of governance frameworks involving like a lot of different stakeholders, and also these different uses of the sea by the land and how activities in the land, that also like how Renan just told us about like how population, for example, and so on in terms of pollution, how this can affect. So my takeaway from bringing together and trying to apply a little bit, I think like these scenarios, for example, both scenarios, territorial scenarios that we develop in BT 2050, they can be used, for example, as I said, like to make a more proactive planning in terms of like a maritime or marine planning, and also can help to see, like, for example, or at least like to not to see what will happen, but what could happen. And this fact of raising this awareness about what could happen is extremely valuable, because prepare stakeholders to deal with like coming up challenges and so on. And this, as we been claiming, like for land sea interactions, and actually that is, yeah, we should coordinate like this land-based with maritime or marine spatial planning, like we can use the scenarios like to draw some conclusions that can be or some future developments, or like some things that could happen in the region. Yeah, I would stop here. I would like to thank you again, and I don't know if you have any questions.